Hi, everybody. So, I'd like to talk about two modes of development that I'm going to encourage you guys to use regardless of the writing situation that you're in. So, whether you're writing an essay for our class, or if you're writing an essay for a different class, or if you're writing an email, I'm going to encourage you that you guys use the two modes, illustration and description. They're just really, really key modes to use to really help your readers kind of understand your points and to keep them engaged. Description is really, really crucial to keep your readers engaged with what you're writing. So we looked at three different essays to analyze illustration. And what I was having you guys kind of think about was how these writers are using illustration. Another word you can use for illustration would be example. So how these writers were using examples or illustrations to support their arguments, to support their thesis. So first let's take a look at Huttman. Huttman's thesis was implicit. She gets to it here when we're in this paragraph 11 here, which she starts talking about, had we, the whole medical community, become so arrogant that we believed in the illusion of salvation through science. So she gets to that, and then this idea, this legal obligation. So that's kind of the one paragraph that really clues us into her implicit or implied thesis. And then at the very end, she says, we do not have the right to die. And those two paragraphs, or those two statements, kind of taken together, help us get at what her thesis is she's calling for do not resuscitate orders. So she's calling for a legal right to die in this essay. So that's what her thesis is. Now, in terms of how she uses illustration or examples to help support that thesis idea, she chooses just one example. So she only chooses to look at this issue in terms of giving us an example of somebody who would benefit from a do not resuscitate order. She just looks at one example, and that example is through Mack. And so her choice here, of course, she's a nurse, so she works on an oncology ward. She probably has seen other scenarios as well. She could have brought in other examples to help support this thesis idea, but she chose, with her limited word count, you guys probably notice how short this is, that it would be better for her argument to develop just one example to allow her this space to really describe the kind of pain and suffering of both Mack and his wife. And so she chose to just use one example to really get at this notion of we need the legal right to die. We need something like do not resuscitate orders. So this was written in the 1980s, right? And so we didn't have those do not resuscitate orders at that time. So that's how Huttman used illustration. So she just did one illustration, one example to get at her thesis idea. When we read the Petsko piece, he did something a little bit different. So for Petsko, his thesis idea, if we want to get at, that's always the first thing. So what is the thesis? And his thesis idea kind of starts, we actually see it stated explicitly here. Here's his, there are many things we can do to fight this trend. There it is again, you guys, that demonstrative pronoun, this trend. What is that referencing? This trend, that's a key thing to understand his thesis. And that's up here. Years of carefully orchestrated attacks by the religious right and other anti-science organizations, combined with public relations and ethical blunders on the part of some scientists, have led to science being regarded by many lay people as just another collection of self-serving, commercially oriented egotist. Quite a sentence, quite a long sentence, but that's the trend he's talking about. Basically, if I could just quickly summarize that giant sentence, basically what he's saying is that people don't trust science, and how can we fight that trend that people don't trust science anymore? And he's saying we need our new iconic image to help kind of fight that trend. So that's what his thesis idea. Now, how does he use illustration or examples to help support it? This is something that some people had noticed, that the illustrations and the examples didn't quite support the thesis as much as maybe it could have. Maybe there were some missteps here that Petsko gave. So he starts off with in terms of the kind of variety of his examples. He starts out with one here talking about the blue marble, which is a science-related one. But then he quickly moves on into other types of illustrations. So dealing with dealing with the kind of Hindenburg bursting into flames. And then he goes on into kind of talking about kind of a couple of iconic images from the Vietnam War area. And so he ends up kind of moving into illustrations that perhaps might kind of distract readers from his thesis idea, which is about science, right? And so readers are hearing about these other things, and they're not science related. Now, it might have worked out to bring in those other iconic images, because he's bringing up those iconic images to show that they can galvanize people behind a movement. So that's why he was bringing up these other types of images, the images about the Hindenburg and the Vietnam War era. So that's the part of his thesis that he's trying to support with these images, which is that with these illustrations, is that these images can help kind of galvanize people around a certain movement. Perhaps the problem, and this is just my own kind of personal feeling, the problem is that he dedicated so much development to those images, and he gave so much backstory that maybe readers would kind of get distracted and start to think that the point of his essay was more about these kind of social concerns rather than what his real issue, which is science, right? Science was his real concern. So perhaps he used a couple of examples. He didn't just do one like Huttman. He used a couple of examples, but maybe this could have been stronger if he would have used all science-related examples, or maybe this could have been stronger if he didn't develop each one of those examples that he had used with kind of such detail. If he would have just focused on the notion that these images help galvanize people around an idea, that might have been more successful. Okay, the last essay I had you guys look at was the Clayton essay. And for this essay, we see Clayton using all kinds of examples. First off, his thesis idea happens in the very last line. He says that American democracy has survived past periods of incivility and will survive this too if we remain clear-eyed. So to get at this notion here that we have survived past periods of incivility, he gives us all kinds of examples, right? So he's got our current examples here of incivility with Rush Limbaugh calling a young woman slut. We have the current illustration of Joe Wilson. And then we start to go back through time, right? And we start to get all these ones kind of from early on in the beginning of our country. So we get the kind of famous John Adams, Thomas Jefferson kind of spat that he was going on. He gave that example. He talks about the famous Sumter kind of attack by Brooks. And so he starts going back through all these different illustrations. And every paragraph, he talks about a different instance, right? So he's using lots and lots of illustrations. So if we kind of think about his thesis idea, if he has to prove that there's been lots of incivility in the past, using lots of different illustrations is probably really important for him. And notice that he doesn't develop any one of these ones kind of in the same way that we saw Petsco. Remember, Petsco brought in an illustration. He had all these sentences kind of developing that. What we see happening here with Clayton is he just mentions it and then moves on, right? He doesn't kind of develop that idea. So he's just kind of doing kind of fast hitting examples to really get at this notion of how we've been incivil in the past. So we have kind of the Clayton model, which is lots of different illustrations and not really developing any one of those in kind of full detail. It's just kind of like rapid fire illustrations. We've got the Petsco, and he's using a couple of illustrations and he's developing. I think there's some lessons we can learn here from the Petsco example. And then we've got the Huttman, and her choice was to just kind of look at one single illustration to really develop her thesis idea. So when you guys are writing, I'm going to encourage that you guys do illustrations, and you might choose for your topic to do something like Huttman. Develop one example kind of sustaining that throughout the entire piece. You might do something like Petsco, or you might do something like Clayton. And so I want you guys to be thinking about how you're going to use illustration in your own writing. Okay, so illustration is super, super important. Description, I'm just going to highlight just really, really briefly. When you're trying to think about, oh, I want to add more description, and I'm going to say, like, even at some point in your writing process, maybe have just a specific kind of 15-minute revision process where your goal of that revision time is just to add more description to your essay. And so when you're adding description, you're thinking about those sensory details. What could you put in there that kind of appeals to see, touch, taste, smell, and hear? And so how can you add those sensory details into your essay? Okay, you guys, or I'm going to say your essay or anything you write. Okay. All right, you guys. Well, we'll talk soon, and I'm looking forward to seeing how you guys use these two really, really crucial modes of development in your own writing. Okay, bye.